A California 1980 cold case was finally solved, and the arrest shocked the entire community. On March 13, 1980, in quiet Ventura, California, respected attorney Lyman Smith and his wife Charlene were brutally murdered in their home. They were bound with drapery cord tied in a strange diamond knot. Charlene was sexually assaulted, and both were bludgeoned to death with a log from their fireplace. The discovery was made by Lyman's 12-year-old son, who found their bodies when his father failed to answer the phone. For nearly 40 years, this crime remained unsolved, haunting detectives and devastating the family. But in 2018, breakthrough forensic genealogy technology led investigators to a shocking suspect living quietly in suburbia, former police officer Joseph James DeAngelo. The man who terrorized California as the Golden State Killer had been hiding in plain sight for decades. How did a trusted cop become America's most prolific killer? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The evening of March 12, 1980, settled over Ventura, California like any other. In the Smith household on High Point Drive, attorney Lyman Smith sat at his mahogany desk, reviewing legal briefs under the warm glow of his reading lamp. His briefcase, worn leather polished smooth by years of court appearances, rested beside him, a symbol of his dedication to justice and the career that many believed would lead him to a judgeship. The case he was preparing involved property rights, mundane compared to what tomorrow would bring. He glanced at the clock and smiled, knowing his 12-year-old son would be calling soon from his mother's house. Charlene moved through their home with the eye of an artist, adjusting a throw pillow here, straightening a picture frame there. Her interior design portfolio lay open on the kitchen counter, filled with fabric samples and floor plans for upcoming projects. She had found her calling in creating beautiful spaces for others, and her work was beginning to gain recognition throughout Ventura County. The portfolio represented dreams and ambitions, a creative life that was just beginning to flourish. When the phone rang, Lyman's face brightened. His son's voice came through clear and excited, sharing stories about school and weekend plans. They made arrangements for the boy to visit the following evening. "I love you, Dad," came the young voice through the receiver. "Love you too, son. See you tomorrow." Lyman hung up. Outside, the quiet streets of their neighborhood held no hint of the storm approaching. Night settled over Ventura, and the Smith house grew still. Dawn broke gray and cool on March 13, 1980. Charlene moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, starting coffee and planning the day ahead. Her interior design portfolio still lay open from the night before, pages marked with notes for client consultations scheduled for later in the week. She hummed softly as she worked, unaware that these would be her final peaceful moments. The sliding glass door that led to their backyard patio remained unlocked, a common practice in their safe neighborhood where crime seemed impossible. Ventura in 1980 was the kind of place where neighbors looked out for each other, where attorneys like Lyman could walk to court without fear, where creative women like Charlene could build businesses on trust and referrals. The morning routine continued undisturbed until it didn't. The intruder entered through that unlocked door, moving with methodical silence through their home. What happened next would shatter not just the lives of Lyman and Charlene Smith, but the illusion of safety that wrapped around their entire community like a security blanket that had suddenly been torn away. The attack unfolded with brutal efficiency. The strange diamond knot that bound them spoke of practice, of other victims, of a predator who had perfected his methods. The fireplace log, meant to warm their home, became the instrument of their destruction. The violation was complete, not just physical, but spiritual, stealing not only lives but the peace that had defined this corner of California. When silence returned to the house, it carried a different weight. The portfolio that had represented Charlene's bright future lay forgotten. Lyman's briefcase sat unopened. Justice delayed indefinitely. Their home, once a sanctuary of love and ambition, had become a crime scene that would haunt Ventura for decades. The afternoon of March 13th stretched long for Lyman's son. School had ended, homework was finished, and dinner at his mother's house was still hours away. He tried calling his father several times, letting the phone ring and ring, but no familiar voice answered. A knot of worry began forming in his 12-year-old stomach. His father always answered the phone, especially when expecting his call. By evening, concern had grown into something sharper. His mother tried to reassure him, suggesting that perhaps Lyman and Charlene had gone out for dinner, or to a movie. But the boy knew his father's habits, knew the reliability that had made him a successful attorney and loving parent. When the phone remained unanswered at 8 o'clock, then 9, the decision was made to drive to the house. The familiar street looked normal in the gathering dusk. Porch lights glowed warm and welcoming along High Point Drive. The Smith house showed no obvious signs of disturbance, no broken windows, no disturbed landscaping, no indication that anything had gone wrong. The boy's mother parked in the driveway and walked with him to the front door. The doorbell echoed through the house without response. They knocked, called out, tried the handle. The door was locked, but they had a key. The boy's mother hesitated, some instinct warning her that something was terribly wrong, but her son was already moving toward the door, driven by a combination of worry and the fearless urgency of youth. The house felt wrong the moment they stepped inside. An oppressive silence hung in the air, different from the comfortable quiet of an empty home. This was the silence of stopped clocks, of interrupted lives, of futures that would never unfold. The boy called out for his father, his voice echoing strangely in rooms that should have been filled with the warmth of family life. They found them in the bedroom. The boy saw his father first, then Charlene, and in that instant, his childhood ended. His mother's scream shattered the terrible quiet, and within minutes, sirens began their wailing approach toward High Point Drive. The phone that had failed to connect father and son now carried the most important call of all to the police, who would spend the next 40 years seeking justice for what had been stolen that day. Detective Rae-Venter arrived at the Smith house as twilight deepened into full darkness. Crime scene lights had transformed the quiet residential street into something from a nightmare, casting harsh shadows and drawing neighbors from their homes to stand in worried clusters behind police tape. Venter had worked homicide for 15 years, but the scene that waited inside the Smith bedroom would stay with him forever. The diamond knot bindings immediately caught his attention. These weren't random restraints tied in panic or rage. They showed skill, practice, a disturbing familiarity with the act of binding victims. The cord had been cut from the Smith's own draperies, but the intricate knot pattern spoke of someone who had done this before. Venter carefully photographed each knot from multiple angles, sensing that these details would prove significant. The brutality of the attack was overwhelming. Both victims had been bludgeoned with a log from their own fireplace, the weapon chosen from their immediate environment, but used with devastating efficiency. The sexual assault of Charlene added another layer of depravity to an already horrific crime. Evidence was collected methodically: blood samples, fingerprints, fibers, anything that might eventually lead them to the killer. The house itself told a story of interrupted normalcy. Charlene's coffee cup sat half empty in the kitchen sink. Lyman's legal papers remained spread across his desk, work that would never be completed. Family photos smiled down from walls and shelves, capturing happier moments that now seemed impossibly distant. Detective Venter bagged the drapery cord with its distinctive knots, knowing these might be the key to everything. In 1980, DNA testing didn't exist, but he preserved biological evidence with unusual care, somehow sensing that science might eventually catch up to his investigation. As he worked through the night, documenting every detail of the crime scene, he made a silent promise to the victims and their families. This case would not be forgotten. The investigation began immediately, but the killer had left few traditional clues. No fingerprints that didn't belong to the family, no witnesses who had seen suspicious activity, no obvious connection between the victims and anyone who might want them dead. The diamond knot became their signature clue, the one detail that seemed to whisper of a larger pattern hidden in the darkness. The funeral for Lyman and Charlene Smith drew hundreds of mourners to the Grace Methodist Church in Ventura. The legal community came in force: judges, attorneys, court clerks who had worked with Lyman over the years. Charlene's clients and fellow designers filled an entire section, their faces etched with shock and grief. But it was the family that bore the heaviest burden, especially the 12-year-old boy who had lost his father and stepmother in one terrible night. The funeral programs, printed on cream-colored paper with gold lettering, tried to capture lives that had been much more than their tragic ending. Lyman's program listed his legal achievements, his nomination for a judgeship, his dedication to community service. Charlene celebrated her artistic eye, her growing business, her ability to create beauty in the world. Both programs ended with the same simple phrase: "Gone too soon." Reverend Matthews struggled to find words that could make sense of such senseless violence. He spoke of lives well lived, of love that death could not diminish, of justice that might be delayed, but would not be denied forever. The congregation listened with raw faces, many crying openly for two people who had been neighbors, colleagues, friends. The burial took place under gray skies that seemed to weep along with the mourners. As the caskets were lowered into the earth, Lyman's son stood between his mother and his grandparents, trying to understand a world that could be forever changed by one night of evil. The finality of dirt hitting wood echoed across the cemetery, but for the family, this was not an ending. It was the beginning of a long wait for answers that might never come. Detective Venter attended the funeral, watching faces in the crowd, looking for anyone who seemed out of place or showed inappropriate emotion. Killers sometimes attended their victims' funerals, drawn by a twisted need to witness the grief they had caused. But everyone present seemed genuinely devastated by the loss of two people who had brought only good into the world. After the service, family members gathered at the Smith house, the same house where the murders had occurred just days before. They moved through rooms that had been released by the police, but still felt haunted by violence. The task of sorting through Lyman and Charlene's belongings seemed overwhelming, each item a reminder of dreams that would never be fulfilled. The coffee cup was still in the sink, now dried and stained. The legal papers still waited on the desk for an attorney who would never return. In that house of interrupted lives, the true magnitude of what had been stolen became clear to all who mourned. As 1980 turned to 1981, then 1982, the Smith murder investigation began, its slow fade from urgent priority to cold case. Detective Biondi retired, passing the file to younger investigators who reviewed the evidence with fresh eyes but found no new leads. The diamond knot photographs were studied by experts in military and maritime fields, but no one could identify the specific technique or its origin. The cold case file box grew thicker with each passing year, filled with dead-end leads, witness statements that led nowhere, and evidence that seemed to point in every direction except toward a suspect. Tips came in sporadically. Neighbors remembered seeing unfamiliar cars. Former clients of Lyman's were investigated and cleared. Transients who had been in the area were tracked down and eliminated as suspects. For the Smith family, each passing year brought a different kind of pain. The sharp agony of fresh grief softened into a constant ache that never fully disappeared. Lyman's son graduated from high school, then college, marking milestones his father would never see. Holidays became exercises in carrying on despite the empty chairs at family gatherings. The case file was transferred from detective to detective as retirements and reassignments shuffled the deck of law enforcement personnel. Each new investigator read through the evidence with determination, hoping to spot something their predecessors had missed. But the killer had been careful, methodical, and lucky. In an era before DNA testing, before computer databases that could link crimes across jurisdictions, the Smith murders remained an isolated horror with no apparent connection to anything else. Yet the diamond knot continued to haunt investigators. Its distinctive pattern suggested military or police training, someone familiar with restraint techniques and comfortable with violence. This detail, preserved in crime scene photographs, would prove to be more significant than anyone realized in 1980. The file box holding these photos and evidence would wait patiently in storage, holding secrets that science was not yet ready to unlock. By 1990, DNA testing had emerged as a revolutionary tool in criminal investigations. The Smith murder case was among hundreds of cold cases reviewed for possible DNA analysis, and the biological evidence that Detective Biondi had so carefully preserved was finally ready to tell its story. The evidence vials, stored in controlled conditions for over a decade, contained the genetic fingerprint of the killer who had remained anonymous for so long. The initial DNA profile was limited by the technology of the early 1990s, but it was enough to confirm what investigators had suspected: the killer was male and unrelated to the victims. More importantly, the DNA sample was suitable for future comparison against suspect profiles and evidence from other crimes. The genetic material became the foundation of renewed hope for justice. Crime labs across California began building DNA databases, storing profiles from both solved and unsolved cases. The process was painstakingly slow, with each sample requiring careful extraction, amplification, and analysis. But for families like the Smiths, who had waited 10 years for answers, the promise of DNA evidence felt like a miracle of modern science. Laboratory technicians handled the Smith case evidence with special care, knowing that these vials represented not just biological material, but the hopes of a family that had never stopped seeking justice. The DNA profile was entered into the California DNA database in 1995, where it waited like a patient hunter for a match that might come tomorrow or might take another decade. Science had finally caught up to the Smith murder investigation, but the killer remained, as elusive as ever. The DNA profile proved that justice was still possible, even after 15 years of silence. Somewhere in California, a man was living his life unaware that his genetic signature was sitting in a computer database, waiting for the right moment to reach out and pull him into the light of accountability. The breakthrough came in 2001 when DNA evidence linked the Smith murders to a series of crimes that had terrorized California throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. The killer responsible for murdering Lyman and Charlene Smith was the same man who had committed dozens of rapes in the Sacramento area as the East Area Rapist and multiple murders throughout Southern California as the original Night Stalker. The DNA connection revealed a pattern of escalating violence that spanned more than a decade and stretched across the entire state. The Smith murders were not an isolated tragedy, but part of a systematic campaign of terror that had shattered dozens of families and left entire communities living in fear. The case files that had seemed unrelated for 20 years suddenly formed a horrifying mosaic of one man's capacity for evil. The original Night Stalker task force reviewed hundreds of pieces of evidence, looking for connections they had missed when the crimes were investigated separately. The diamond knot that had puzzled investigators in the Smith case was found in other crime scenes, along with similar patterns of breaking and entering, victim selection, and brutal violence. The killer had refined his methods over time, but certain signatures remained consistent. For investigators who had worked these cases in isolation, the DNA connections provided both vindication and frustration. They had been right to sense that something larger was at work, but the fragmented nature of law enforcement jurisdictions had prevented them from seeing the full scope of the killer's activities. The man they were hunting was not just a murderer, but a serial killer of unprecedented scope and skill. The renewed investigation brought fresh attention to the Smith case and dozens of others. Victim families who had felt forgotten suddenly found themselves part of a much larger story. The DNA evidence promised that justice was still possible, but it also revealed the true magnitude of what they were up against: a predator who had operated with impunity for years and had never been caught. The Golden State Killer earned his nickname from true crime writer Michelle McNamara, whose book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, brought unprecedented public attention to the decades-old case. Podcasts, television documentaries, and online forums dissected every aspect of the crimes, creating a community of amateur investigators determined to see justice served. The Smith murders, once a forgotten tragedy, became part of a national conversation about unsolved crimes and the persistence of truth. True crime enthusiasts studied crime scene photos, timelines, and evidence with the dedication of professional investigators. The diamond knot became an iconic image, reproduced in documentaries and discussed in online forums. Armchair detectives compared notes, shared theories, and kept pressure on law enforcement to continue pursuing leads that might have grown cold without public interest. Victim families found themselves thrust into an unwelcome spotlight, their private grief becoming part of a public narrative. Some embraced the attention, grateful that their loved ones would not be forgotten. Others struggled with seeing their personal tragedies turned into entertainment for millions of strangers. The Smith family navigated this new reality with grace, understanding that public pressure might be the key to finally finding their killer. The true crime community's obsession with the Golden State Killer created a feedback loop of information sharing and theory building that supplemented official investigation efforts. Tips poured in from across the country as people remembered strange incidents, suspicious neighbors, and unexplained encounters from decades past. While most led nowhere, the sheer volume of public attention ensured that the case remained a priority for law enforcement. Podcasters spoke the victims' names with reverence, ensuring that Lyman and Charlene Smith were remembered as people who had lived full lives before their murders defined them. The microphone became a symbol of voices speaking for those who had been silenced, demanding justice that had been delayed for far too long. The revolutionary moment came in 2018 when investigators uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where people search for family connections through genetic testing. The computer screen that displayed potential family matches represented the convergence of cutting-edge technology with old-fashioned detective work. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, investigators had a tool that could identify their suspect through his relatives. The genealogy search produced several potential family trees, forcing investigators to become part-time genealogists as they traced bloodlines and family histories. Each name on the family tree had to be researched, verified, and either eliminated or pursued further. The process was painstakingly slow, but it represented the first real progress in the case, since DNA had linked the various crime series together. Genetic genealogist Barbara Rae-Venter worked with investigators to build family trees from the DNA matches, following genetic breadcrumbs through marriages, births, and deaths spanning more than a century. Her expertise in both genetics and genealogy proved invaluable as the investigation narrowed its focus to specific family lines that could have produced the Golden State Killer. The breakthrough technology that made the identification possible represented a fundamental shift in criminal investigation. No longer would killers be able to hide behind the anonymity of time and careful planning. DNA evidence, combined with genealogy databases, could reach decades into the past and pull suspects from ordinary lives into the harsh light of justice. As the family tree took shape on computer screens in the Sacramento District Attorney's office, investigators felt the electric anticipation of a hunt that was finally nearing its end. Somewhere in California, a man who had terrorized the state for years was living quietly, unaware that science and persistence were closing in on him. The GED match database had become the key that would finally unlock the door to justice for Lyman and Charlene Smith. The family tree led investigators to Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer living quietly in Citrus Heights, California. His police badge, earned through the Exeter Police Department in the 1972nd, represented not just a career in law enforcement, but a betrayal of the public trust that would shock the nation. The man who had sworn to protect and serve had been the very predator that communities across California had feared for decades. DeAngelo's law enforcement background explained many of the peculiarities that had puzzled investigators for years. His knowledge of police procedures, evidence collection, and investigation techniques had helped him evade capture while committing dozens of crimes. The skills he had learned to catch criminals had been perverted into methods for avoiding capture as he became one of California's most prolific serial killers. Surveillance teams began monitoring DeAngelo's daily routines, observing a 72-year-old man who appeared utterly ordinary to his neighbors. He lived in a modest house, tended his garden, and moved through his retirement with no outward signs of the monster he had once been. The contrast between his mundane present and his horrific past would have been impossible to believe if not for the DNA evidence that linked him conclusively to the crimes. Investigators confirmed DeAngelo's identity through multiple sources, cross-referencing his employment history, residential addresses, and personal details with the timeline of the Golden State Killer attacks. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. The retired police officer who had lived peacefully in suburbia for decades was responsible for murders, rapes, and burglaries that had terrorized California from 1976 to 1986. The irony was overwhelming. A man trained to solve crimes had become the criminal that an entire state had been seeking. His badge represented the ultimate violation of public trust, transforming the symbol of protection into an emblem of betrayal. For victim families who had trusted law enforcement to find justice, the revelation that their tormentor had once worn the same badge as their protectors added another layer of pain to an already unbearable situation. DNA collection from DeAngelo required careful planning to ensure legal admissibility in court. Surveillance teams collected discarded items from his trash, including tissues and food containers that might contain his genetic material. The discarded tissue that ultimately provided the conclusive DNA match had been thrown away without thought, but it became the physical evidence that would link DeAngelo to decades of unsolved crimes. Laboratory analysis of the tissue sample confirmed what investigators already knew but needed to prove beyond any doubt. Joseph James DeAngelo was the Golden State Killer. The DNA profile from the tissue matched perfectly with evidence collected from the Smith crime scene and dozens of other attacks. After nearly 40 years, science had finally provided irrefutable proof of the killer's identity. The moment the DNA results were confirmed, the Smith murder case transformed from a cold case to an active arrest warrant. Prosecutors began preparing charges that would encompass not just the Smith murders but the full scope of DeAngelo's crimes across multiple jurisdictions. The tissue that had seemed like simple trash became the key piece of evidence in one of the most significant serial killer arrests in American history. Investigators coordinated with multiple law enforcement agencies to ensure that DeAngelo's arrest would be handled professionally and safely. Given his age and frail appearance, they didn't expect resistance, but his law enforcement background meant that he understood police tactics and might try to destroy evidence or flee if he suspected he was being watched. The DNA match represented the culmination of decades of work by hundreds of investigators, crime lab technicians, and genetic genealogists. A single tissue, carelessly discarded, had become the bridge between a killer's past and present, proving that justice might be delayed but could not be denied forever. For the Smith family and dozens of other victim families, the DNA confirmation meant that their long wait for answers was finally nearing its end. On April 24, 2018, SWAT teams surrounded DeAngelo's house in the pre-dawn darkness, preparing to arrest one of California's most wanted killers. Body cameras recorded every moment of the operation, documenting the end of a manhunt that had lasted nearly 4 decades. The quiet suburban street erupted with the controlled chaos of a major arrest as law enforcement finally closed in on their target. D'Angelo emerged from his house looking frail and confused, a far cry from the athletic young man who had terrorized California in the 1972nd and 1980s. His neighbors watched in stunned disbelief as the man they had known as a quiet retiree was led away in handcuffs, charged with murders that had made headlines before some of them were born. The arrest made international news, with media outlets struggling to convey the magnitude of what had just occurred. The Golden State Killer, who had seemed like a ghost for decades, was, suddenly, a flesh-and-blood human being with a name, an address, and a criminal justice system ready to hold him accountable for his crimes. Television crews lined the street outside D'Angelo's house, interviewing neighbors who expressed shock and disbelief. The man they described bore no resemblance to the brutal killer who had terrorized California. He had been polite, kept to himself, and shown no signs of the violence that had defined his younger years. The disconnect between his public persona and his secret crimes would become a recurring theme in the coverage of his arrest. For investigators who had worked the Golden State Killer case for years or decades, the arrest represented both triumph and exhaustion. They had finally caught their man, but the process of prosecuting him for dozens of crimes committed across multiple jurisdictions would require years of additional work. The body camera footage of his arrest would be replayed countless times, marking the moment when one of America's most elusive serial killers was finally brought to justice. The phone call came on the morning of April 25, 2018, 48 hours after D'Angelo's arrest made headlines across the nation. Lyman Smith's son, now a middle-aged man with children of his own, received the notification that investigators had been waiting decades to deliver. The man responsible for his father's and stepmother's murders had finally been identified, arrested, and charged with their crimes. The victim notification letter that followed provided official confirmation of what the family had hoped for and dreaded in equal measure. After 38 years of waiting, they finally had a name to attach to their pain: Joseph James D'Angelo. The letter detailed his arrest and the DNA evidence that linked him conclusively to the Smith murders, but it could not convey the complex emotions that came with such long-delayed news. Relief mixed with anger, vindication with renewed grief, hope with the bitter recognition that justice had come too late for some family members who had died without ever knowing the killer's identity. The notification represented both an ending and a beginning, the end of wondering who had destroyed their family, and the beginning of a legal process that would force them to relive the worst moments of their lives in a public courtroom. Victim advocates met with the Smith family to explain what would happen next, preparing them for a trial that would likely take years to complete. The legal system that had failed to provide quick justice was now ready to ensure thorough justice, but that meant more waiting, more uncertainty, and more public attention on their private tragedy. The family's first reaction was gratitude to the investigators who had never given up, even when the case seemed hopeless. Detective Biondi had long since retired, but his careful preservation of evidence in 1980 had made the 2018 arrest possible. The notification letter represented the vindication of his promise that the case would not be forgotten, even though he had not lived to see its resolution. The legal proceedings moved slowly through the complex machinery of the California court system. Pre-trial hearings stretched across months, as defense attorneys filed motion after motion, challenging evidence, questioning procedures, and seeking delays that further prolonged the family's wait for resolution. Each hearing meant another day in court for victim families, reliving trauma that was now nearly 4 decades old. Defense motions challenged everything, from the constitutionality of the genealogy search to the admissibility of evidence collected in 1980. Legal scholars debated whether using public DNA databases to solve crimes violated privacy rights, turning the Smith case into a precedent-setting legal battle that would influence future investigations. The motion documents, filed by both prosecution and defense, created a legal paper trail that documented every aspect of the case. For victim families who had waited so long for justice, each filing felt like another obstacle between them and the closure they desperately sought. The legal process that should have provided resolution instead created new sources of anxiety and frustration. Court appearances became a regular part of life for the Smith family and other victim families. They formed informal support networks, sharing rides to hearings and emotional support during difficult testimony. The courthouse became a second home for people who would have preferred never to see the inside of a courtroom. Prosecutors worked tirelessly to prepare a case that would hold up under the intense scrutiny that such a high-profile trial would receive. They coordinated with multiple jurisdictions, organized decades of evidence, and prepared victim families for the emotional ordeal of testifying about events that had shaped their entire adult lives. In June 2020, D'Angelo's legal team announced that their client would plead guilty to multiple murder and kidnapping charges in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole. The plea agreement papers represented the end of legal maneuvering and the beginning of long-awaited accountability for crimes that had traumatized California for decades. The plea deal was controversial among some victim families who had hoped to see D'Angelo face the death penalty for his crimes. Others welcomed the agreement as a way to avoid years of additional legal proceedings and the uncertainty of a trial outcome. The papers that formalized the agreement ensured that D'Angelo would die in prison, even if the state wouldn't actively end his life. For the Smith family, the plea agreement meant they would finally have the opportunity to confront their loved one's killer in court. Victim impact statements would give them a voice they had been denied for 40 years, a chance to speak directly to the man who had destroyed their family and to tell him about the lives he had stolen. Prosecutors carefully reviewed the plea agreement to ensure that it covered all jurisdictions and all crimes for which they had sufficient evidence. The document represented a compromise between the desire for ultimate punishment and the practical reality of ensuring conviction and closure for victim families who had already waited far too long. The agreement also meant that details of D'Angelo's crimes would be read into the court record, providing an official accounting of his decades-long campaign of terror. For families who had lived with unanswered questions, the plea proceedings would finally provide complete documentation of what their loved ones had endured, and confirmation that justice, however delayed, had finally arrived. On June 29, 2020, Joseph James D'Angelo stood before Judge Michael Bowman in Sacramento Superior Court and admitted his guilt to 13 murders and 13 kidnapping charges. The court transcript of his guilty plea would become part of the official record, documenting the moment when California's most elusive serial killer finally acknowledged responsibility for decades of terror. "Guilty," D'Angelo said when asked how he pleaded to the murder of Lyman Smith. His voice was barely audible, cracked with age and perhaps with the weight of finally admitting to crimes he had hidden for 40 years. The single word carried the weight of decades of denial, investigation, and family grief. For Lyman's son, sitting in the courtroom gallery, hearing his father's killer finally admit guilt, provided a moment of vindication he had wondered if he would ever experience. "Guilty?" came the response again when asked about Charlene Smith's murder. Each repetition of the word felt like a small piece of justice being delivered, one count at a time. The judicial process that had taken 4 decades to reach this point was methodically checking off each crime, each victim, each life that D'Angelo had destroyed during his years of violence. The courtroom was packed with victim families, law enforcement officers, and media representatives who had followed the case for years. Many victims' relatives held hands or embraced as they heard D'Angelo's admissions, experiencing a complex mix of relief, anger, and grief that no amount of legal proceedings could fully resolve. Judge Bowman carefully read each charge and recorded each guilty plea, ensuring that the court record would be complete and legally sound. The transcript would serve as permanent documentation that Joseph James D'Angelo had finally been held accountable for murders that had haunted California since 1980. After 40 years of silence, lies, and denials, the truth had finally been spoken in a court of law. The days following D'Angelo's guilty plea were dedicated to victim impact statements, giving families their first opportunity to speak directly to the man who had shattered their lives. The Smith family prepared carefully for their moment in court, crafting words that could somehow convey 4 decades of pain, anger, and lost opportunity. Their handwritten notes represented years of imagined conversations with their loved one's killer. Lyman's son stepped to the microphone with a mixture of nervousness and determination. He spoke about the father he had lost, the stepmother he was just learning to love, and the life that had been forever changed by one night of violence. His words were measured and dignified, refusing to give D'Angelo the satisfaction of seeing his victims' families destroyed by his actions. "You stole my father's future," he said, looking directly at D'Angelo, who sat motionless at the defense table. "You stole Charlene's dreams. You stole our family's sense of safety and trust, but you did not steal our love for them, or our determination to see justice done." The impact statement became both an accusation and a declaration of survival, proving that victims' families could endure even the worst tragedies. Other family members spoke about the ripple effects of the murders, describing how the trauma had affected multiple generations. Children had grown up knowing their family was touched by tragedy. Grandchildren had been born into a legacy of unanswered questions, and holidays had forever been marked by empty chairs and interrupted traditions. The courtroom echoed with raw emotion as family after family spoke about loved ones who had been reduced to evidence files and crime scene photographs. Their words restored humanity to the victims, transforming them from case numbers back into people who had been loved, missed, and mourned for decades. The impact statements served as a final act of advocacy for those who could no longer speak for themselves. Media coverage of D'Angelo's guilty plea and the victim impact statements dominated news cycles across California and the nation. Headlines struggled to capture the magnitude of what had just occurred. Golden State Killer finally faces justice 4 decades later. Families find closure. DNA technology solves California's most notorious cold case. The Smith murders, once a forgotten tragedy, were now part of a national conversation about persistence, technology, and the pursuit of justice. Television reporters stood outside the courthouse, interviewing victim family members who were willing to share their stories with the public. Many spoke about the importance of never giving up hope, even when years passed without progress. Their faces showed the strain of decades-long grief, but also the relief of finally having answers to questions that had haunted them since 1980. True crime podcasters who had helped keep public attention focused on the Golden State Killer case, dedicated special episodes to the resolution of the Smith murders and other crimes. They read the names of all the victims, ensuring that people like Lyman and Charlene Smith would be remembered as individuals rather than just statistics in a larger criminal case. The national media attention brought recognition to the investigators, prosecutors, and genetic genealogists who had worked tirelessly to solve these decades-old crimes. Their persistence and innovative use of new technology had not only brought justice to the Smith family, but had also demonstrated new possibilities for solving other cold cases that had seemed hopeless. News coverage also highlighted the advancement of DNA technology and genetic genealogy as tools for solving crimes. The Smith case became a symbol of how science could reach across decades to deliver justice, inspiring other families with unsolved cases to maintain hope that their answers might still come. August 21, 2020, marked the end of the longest criminal case in California history when Judge Bowman sentenced Joseph James D'Angelo to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The crime scene photos that had haunted investigators for 40 years were presented one final time, showing the jury and the court the full brutality of what D'Angelo had done to Lyman and Charlene Smith and dozens of other victims. The photographs, some taken with 1980s police cameras and others enhanced by modern forensic techniques, provided stark evidence of the violence that had shattered so many families. The diamond knot that had puzzled investigators for decades was displayed prominently, its intricate pattern finally explained as the signature of a methodical killer who had perfected his techniques through repeated practice. Prosecutors methodically presented evidence from each crime scene, ensuring that the court record would contain complete documentation of D'Angelo's decades-long campaign of terror. The presentation took hours, with each photograph and piece of evidence serving as a memorial to victims who had been silenced by violence, but would not be forgotten by justice. Family members in the courtroom gallery held hands and supported each other as the evidence was presented. For many, seeing the crime scene photos was traumatic, but it was also validating proof that their loved one's suffering had been officially recognized and that their killer would be held accountable for the full extent of his crimes. The silence that hung in the courtroom during the evidence presentation was different from the silence that had marked 40 years of unanswered questions. This was the silence of resolution, of a legal system finally fulfilling its promise to seek justice for those who could no longer seek it for themselves. The photographs that had once represented unsolved mysteries now stood as evidence of crime solved and justice delivered. Judge Bowman's sentencing order was read with ceremonial formality, each word carefully chosen to reflect the magnitude of the crimes and the finality of the punishment. "The defendant shall serve life in prison without the possibility of parole," the judge intoned, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority and moral judgment. The gavel that fell after his words marked the official end of a case that had defined the careers of countless investigators and the lives of victim families. The sentencing order represented more than just legal punishment. It was society's formal acknowledgement that Joseph James D'Angelo's crimes warranted the most severe penalty available under the plea agreement. For victim families who had waited 40 years for justice, the judge's words provided official closure to a chapter of their lives that had remained painfully open for too long. D'Angelo showed no emotion as the sentence was read, maintaining the same blank expression he had worn throughout the proceedings. His lack of visible remorse frustrated many victim family members, who had hoped to see some sign that he understood the magnitude of the pain he had caused. Instead, they witnessed a man who seemed disconnected from the consequences of his actions, even as those consequences finally caught up with him. The families in the courtroom gallery held hands and embraced as the gavel fell, their tears reflecting both relief and the recognition that no sentence could truly repair the damage that had been done. Justice had been served, but their loved ones would remain gone, their futures forever stolen by a man who would now spend his remaining years in a prison cell. The sentencing marked the beginning of D'Angelo's life as a convicted murderer rather than an unidentified suspect. He would be transported to a maximum security prison where he would live out his days in the same kind of isolation he had imposed on his victims' families through 4 decades of silence. In the days following D'Angelo's sentencing, victim families gathered privately to remember their loved ones as they had lived, not as they had died. The Smith family visited Lyman and Charlene's graves for the first time since the arrest, bringing fresh flowers to replace the memorial arrangements that had been placed there over the years. These flowers represented memory over victimhood, love over loss. The graveside visit was quiet and personal, attended only by immediate family members who had shared the burden of unanswered questions for so long. They spoke to Lyman and Charlene as if they were present, telling them about the arrest, the trial, and the sentence that had finally brought justice for their murders. The conversation was one-sided but healing, providing closure that had been impossible while their killer remained unknown. Family members shared memories of Lyman and Charlene as they had been in life, successful, loving, and full of plans for the future. They remembered Lyman's dedication to justice and wondered what he would have thought about the decades-long investigation that had finally brought his killer to account. They recalled Charlene's artistic vision and creative spirit, qualities that had been cut short but not forgotten. The memorial flowers were arranged carefully around the headstones, each bloom representing a different aspect of lives that had been much more than their tragic endings. Red roses for love, white lilies for peace, yellow sunflowers for the brightness they had brought to the world during their time together. The flowers would fade, but the memory they represented would endure. As family members prepared to leave the cemetery, they felt a sense of completion that had been missing for 40 years. Justice had been served, truth had been revealed, and their loved ones could finally rest in peace knowing that their killer would never harm another family. The flowers left behind marked not just graves, but the end of a long journey toward justice. Months after D'Angelo's sentencing, the Ventura community reflected on how the resolution of the Smith murders had affected their understanding of safety, justice, and the persistence of truth. Community leaders organized memorial events that honored not just Lyman and Charlene Smith but all victims of the Golden State Killer, acknowledging that healing required collective recognition of shared trauma and survival. The case had demonstrated that some crimes resonate far beyond their immediate victims, touching entire communities and leaving lasting impacts on how people view their safety and security. For Ventura residents who had lived through the fear and uncertainty following the 1980 murders, D'Angelo's conviction provided a form of community closure that had been impossible while the killer remained unknown. True crime advocates who had helped keep public attention focused on the case were credited with contributing to its eventual resolution. Their podcasts, websites, and social media campaigns had ensured that cases like the Smith murders remained in the public consciousness, creating pressure on law enforcement to continue pursuing justice, even when leads ran cold. The Smith case became a symbol of perseverance for other families dealing with unsolved crimes. Victim advocacy groups pointed to the 40-year journey from crime to conviction as proof that justice was always possible, even when it seemed impossibly distant. The case inspired new efforts to apply genetic genealogy to other cold cases, holding out hope for families who had been waiting for their own answers. Local schools and community organizations used the case as an opportunity to discuss the importance of supporting victims' families and maintaining faith in the justice system, even when that system seemed to fail. The story of the Smith murders became a teaching tool about resilience, persistence, and the power of communities to heal from even the most devastating tragedies. As the sun set over the Ventura coastline, painting the Pacific Ocean in shades of gold and crimson, the Smith family found peace in knowing that their long journey toward justice had finally reached its end. The sunset photo taken that evening would become a symbol of closure, marking the transition from a 40-year period of questions to a new chapter of acceptance and healing. The coastal view that Lyman and Charlene had loved during their life together now served as a backdrop for reflection on their legacy and the justice that had finally been achieved in their memory. The natural beauty of the California coast provided a stark contrast to the ugliness of the crimes that had been committed, but it also offered hope that beauty and peace could ultimately triumph over violence and fear. Family members stood together watching the sunset, sharing quiet conversation about the future and how they would choose to remember this day. The sentencing, the trial, and even the arrest would fade into memory, but the knowledge that justice had been served would remain a source of comfort for years to come. The photograph captured not just a beautiful sunset but a moment of transition for a family that had been defined by tragedy for too long. They were finally free to remember Lyman and Charlene without the constant reminder of unanswered questions about their deaths. The image would serve as a reminder that even the darkest chapters of life could eventually give way to moments of peace and resolution. As darkness fell over the coast, the family felt ready to return to lives that were no longer dominated by the need for justice. They had fought for 40 years to see their loved one's killer held accountable, and now they could focus on preserving the memory of who Lyman and Charlene had been, rather than how they had died. Today, an engraved memorial plaque stands in the Ventura courthouse, where Lyman Smith once practiced law, ensuring that he and Charlene are remembered for their contributions to the community rather than their victimization. The plaque serves as a permanent tribute to lives that were cut short but not forgotten, representing the enduring power of love and memory to transcend even the most devastating losses. The inscription reads simply, "In memory of Lyman and Charlene Smith, whose lives enriched our community and whose memory inspired a 40-year pursuit of justice. May their legacy remind us that truth cannot be hidden forever and that love endures beyond loss." The words were chosen by family members who wanted the memorial to celebrate life rather than mourn death. Colleagues and clients who had worked with Lyman visited the plaque regularly, remembering a man who had dedicated his career to justice and who had finally received the justice he had always sought for others. Law students studying at the courthouse often paused to read the inscription, learning about the importance of persistence and the value of never giving up on the pursuit of truth. The memorial plaque became a gathering place for other families dealing with unsolved crimes, who found inspiration in the Smith family's 40-year journey, from tragedy to justice. Victim advocates brought groups to the courthouse to show them that resolution was possible, even when it seemed impossibly distant. For the Smith family, the plaque represented the final chapter in their quest for justice and the beginning of a new phase of remembrance focused on celebration rather than mourning. Lyman and Charlene's names were permanently etched in bronze, ensuring that future generations would know them as people who had lived meaningful lives and inspired an extraordinary pursuit of justice. The word justice appeared at the bottom of the plaque, simple and final, representing both the end of a long journey and the eternal principle that had guided every step along the way. Justice had come late to the Smith family, but it had come completely, bringing with it the peace that only truth can provide.